Hello, and welcome everyone to the second podcast for day 37, chapter 54 on community ecology. In this objective, we're going to cover the second half of objective 1, from predation through symbiosis. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about this term predation. Simply put, this is a symbiotic relationship of sorts where one of the organisms eats another organism. So in this predation relationship here, you have a predator. This could be like a lion. And then you have prey. And an example of a prey might be the zebra we talked about earlier. Often we think of these kinds of relationships, but also we could think of a predator as a zebra. Zebras don't eat meat, but they eat the grass. And so you could think in this kind of relationship that the grass would be the prey. And we would classify this first one as carnivory, and over here we would classify this as herbivory, where the predator eats some kind of plant. Next, let's talk about predator adaptations. And prey adaptations. So we can see how both of these are going to be useful during evolution, during natural selection. Natural selection is going to favor adaptations that allow the predator a better opportunity to catch the prey. On the other hand, natural selection is going to favor prey who have adaptations that prevent them from getting captured by the predator. So some examples of predator adaptations might be acute senses. This could be hearing, sight, smell, where they can sense the prey and find the prey better. You know, like the vision of an owl. They're able to see very well at night, and they have excellent vision in general, and so they're able to find that prey a lot easier. Claws would be an adaptation. Imagine a lion without claws. They would not be very effective at finding or capturing their prey. Sharp teeth, stingers, venom, and we could go on. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples if you think about your favorite predator. What has allowed them to be good at being a predator, to have survived? What adaptations do they have? Some examples of adaptations by prey could also be acute senses, right? If they can sense that predator presence, they're going to avoid it. For instance, if you've ever lived in a house where there might have been mice in there, and then you buy a cat, the cat doesn't necessarily have to catch the mice. The mice will sense the cat there, they will smell the cat there, and they will avoid that area. At least the smart ones will, right? Those who have adapted those senses. The other ones, well, they get caught by the cat. We also have some things like camouflage. So I'm going to put coloration, and we'll talk a little bit about coloration in a moment, where they can blend into the environment, or they can mimic the coloration of another animal. You could think of being fast, speedy. That could also go up here as well. Whatever kind of adaptations they might have that would prevent them from more likely being caught by our predator. But this kind of relationship here between the predator and prey, they together work at providing strong selective forces for natural selection. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about these adaptations. So let's erase this. Let's write cryptic coloration. This is the same thing as camouflage. Which is a term you're probably more familiar with. We can think of this as being a passive defense that makes a potential very difficult to spot against its background. And you've probably seen many kinds of examples of this. Your book talks about the canyon tree frog and how when it's laying on the ground near the dirt and the rocks, it's very hard to see it. It's hard for us to see it. It's hard for the prey to see it. I'm sorry, it's hard for a predator to find it. So if you had this, large environment here, and you had the background, this area is this greenish color, and you had a frog that was right here, it's really hard to see that frog. However, if you had a frog over here, he's pretty easy to see. And this frog's not going to be as protected against its background as this frog. And as a result, this frog is going to survive, it's going to reproduce more, it's going to be a more fit organism, and so it's going to have more progeny that look like it. And so through natural selection, this kind of coloration pattern is going to survive and be passed on from generation to generation. Whereas this one's not going to be so lucky. But everybody's got to eat, right? So let's not be too hard on the predators. So this next example of aposematic coloration is best explained when we think about a brightly colored animal like a frog. And you've probably seen examples of this where you may have a rainforest here, and we're just going to make it green. And then you have this brightly colored animal, right? And remember, on the previous example, we said cryptic coloration allowed this animal to survive because the predator couldn't find it. But sometimes these really brightly colored animals serves as a caution to the predators, because these brightly colored animals often have a chemical defense mechanism. And so when an animal eats this brightly colored frog, say, it gets sick and dies. Those animals that recognize not to eat these brightly colored frogs survive, and they produce progeny that also now know not to eat this brightly colored frog. Again, so this is another cause of natural selection. Those animals who have adapted the ability to not eat the brightly colored frogs survive, and they pass their genes on, and so they are more fit. Those who don't have that sense will eat this frog and they'll die, and they won't reproduce as often. So now they're protected. So we have kind of two different kinds of examples where it's good to look like the environment, and sometimes it's good not to look like the environment, because you stand out and animals know not to eat you. So these animals that have these chemical defenses that are brightly colored would be an example of aposematic coloration. We often think of amphibians like frogs in this, but let's also remember that plants possess these same kinds of defenses. The foxglove, for instance, produces a toxin that, if it's eaten, will kill the animal. And so it has more of a brighter color, and maybe animals will stay away from that. Another defense mechanism, more of a mechanical defense mechanism, but animals know not to eat them, would be something like a cactus, where those spines on the cactus will prevent animals from eating it. These are all adaptations that favor the prey. Now let's talk a little bit more about coloration that can be used in this predator-prey relationship. The first one that I want to talk about is called Batesian mimicry. The classic example of this is looking at the coral snake. And the coral snake is a very venomous snake. And it has a pattern where it has black stripes that separate like a red coloration. And then there's some yellow. I don't have a yellow marker, but I have an orange one, so I'm going to make it orange. And animals, because of this bright color, would know to avoid this animal, because it's going to bite you and it's going to make you sick or it may kill you. If I see a snake like this, I'm going to avoid it because I know if I touch it, it might bite me and it's going to make me sick and it may actually kill me. Another snake, so this is our coral snake. So this other snake, let's call this the scarlet king snake. Is not venomous. So let's also write up here venomous. And this one is not venomous. But it has a very similar pattern. It's not identical, but it's similar. So I'm just going to draw something that's kind of similar here. Now an animal that might want to eat this as a potential prey is going to look at this and sense that it's very similar to this one. In fact, an animal may not be able to tell the difference between it. I'm not a snake expert. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between this. So if I saw this snake, I'm not going to touch it either because I don't know the difference. And I'm going to recognize this coloration as a danger. And so I'm going to avoid it. All the while, though, this scarlet king snake could bite you all day long. And it's not going to, well, it'll hurt you, but it's not going to kill you. But I'm going to avoid it. And so also will animals that eat snakes because they know from experience, not really from experience, but they've adapted characteristics to know to avoid this kind of snake coloration. So any snake that looks like this, they're also going to avoid. So this is an example of Batesian mimicry. Next I want to talk about Munerian mimicry. This is an example when you have two species that are both dangerous. An example might be they both are venomous, share similar coloration. The example your book gives, and it's a very classic example, so we'll go ahead and talk about that, is you have two kinds of bees. You have a cuckoo bee, and then you have a yellow-jacket bee, one that we're more familiar with seeing. Both of these bees will sting you. They will both give you a venom, and so you want to avoid both of them. And they look very similar. So it's an example of where two different species have adapted a very similar coloration pattern, and so animals recognize that you want to stay away from both of these. It's kind of like doubling the effect of it. It works for one, so it works for the other. And now any kind of animal that looks like this, you're going to avoid. I think of it sort of with martial arts and the different levels of that. You know, if somebody karate or taekwondo or judo, if my memory is correct, they all wear a black belt at their highest rank. So it doesn't matter if they're a taekwondo or karate. If you see a black belt, you know that they are experts in martial arts, and you're probably not going to pick a fight with either one of them. Same thing with the bees. You see any one of these bees, it doesn't matter which one it is, you know they're going to hurt you if you try to grab it, or if you try to touch it, or if you try to irritate it. It's doubling the effect of it. So you should be comfortable telling the difference between, if we provide an example of a different animal species, if it's Munerian or if it is Batesian. Now we want to talk about symbiotic relationships. And we've already talked a little bit about this when we talked about bacteria. So let's just define symbiotic relationship first. This is a relationship where two or more species interact with each other in the same environment. So I'm going to write that a little different. So an interaction between two or more species that live together in direct contact. Okay, now let's talk about the three kinds of symbiotic relationships. We've already talked a little bit about these when we talked about microbiology, but let's talk about it now in the context of the ecology section. And let's begin with parasitism. This is a kind of symbiotic relationship where one individual benefits and the other is harmed. Lots of examples of this that we can come up with, and the example I want to give is the tick and the moose. The tick is a parasite, and it will attach to the moose, and the tick needs to do this in order to survive, so the tick clearly benefits. Perhaps initially the moose doesn't have any harm to it, but over time this tick will begin to harm the moose in several ways. It makes the moose weaker. It itself can kill the moose, but it can also just make the moose slower and less agile, which makes it more subjective to being eaten by a predator such as a wolf. It clearly has a negative result on the moose. Next, let's talk about mutualism. With mutualism, both organisms in the symbiotic relationship benefit. And I think a good example of this is thinking about bees and pollination. So you may have, flowers here, and you may have flowers here. So these are my flowers. And then we have our bees. And our bees are going to pollinate this flower. And they're attracted to the flower because of the nectar that's in the flower. Rich source of nutrients for the bee. So it comes here to drink the nectar, or to consume the nectar. And while it's doing that, what will happen is that pollen grains will attach to the bee, to its wings, to its body. And now, as this bee goes from flower to flower, now it's going to come over to this flower. And when it does that, it's going to deposit the pollen from this red flower over here to this blue flower. In this kind of a relationship, what we see is that the bee is clearly benefiting because it's getting this rich source of nutrients, the nectar. And the flowers benefit because they're able to cross-pollinate between distances. Remember, one of the biggest disadvantages the plants have is they can't move. They can move, like grow towards the sun or things like that, and the roots grow, but they can't physically move, of course. And so the bees help them do this cross-pollination since they can't move. And another example is if you think about the angiosperms. They produce this nice fruit, and animals may eat this fruit. And so that animal that eats the fruit, so the bear that eats the strawberries, it benefits because it's eating the strawberries. It has that source of nutrition. And then the plants benefit because as that fruit goes through its digestive system, the bear doesn't digest the seed inside of that fruit. It will pass through its digestive system and allow for that seed to be dispersed to other parts of the forest. So those are two good examples of mutualism. Commensalism. Let's talk about commensalism. Let's talk about next Commensalism. This is when one member of the symbiotic relationship benefits and the other is unaffected. My personal view is there are very few commensal relationships, and really what's happening is we just don't appreciate or understand how the other is really affected. But for now, we do have to think of them as being commensal because we don't know how it's affected. And there are two good examples I think we can talk about. One would be a turtle. So let's draw a turtle here. Alright, here's our turtle. And on many turtles, there will be moss that grows on it. And I'm just going to draw that on here with a different shade of green. The moss on this turtle clearly benefits because the turtle is providing a substrate for the moss. It's also providing a nice moist environment because remember, mosses are one of the plant groups that require to be grown in a moist environment. So the moss is benefiting in this relationship. It becomes less clear how the turtle benefits in this. As of now, we don't know how the turtle benefits. So we would call this a commensal relationship. We may find out one day that the moss provides maybe some sort of camouflage for the turtle, or maybe it provides some kind of chemical that benefits the turtle. But as of now, we don't see any way that the turtle benefits. This ends this podcast. If you have any questions, please let us know.